top 40 PPR wide receivers and tiers post Cooper Kupp injury. If you want a more detailed breakdown on some of these players, check out my wide receiver breakdowns up here. Starting off with the cream of the crop, the safest wide receiver in the league, Justin Jefferson. He's an absolute beast. He's had over 100 receptions in back-to-back years and has increased his yards by 200 every year for the last 3 years, ending with 1,800 yards last year. Wild. And he still has room to grow up with his touchdowns, only getting 8 last year. I'm not worried about Jordan Addison. He needs somebody on the other side anyways. Adam Thielen was getting old. If Jordan Addison proves to be pretty solid, I'm not saying he's going to take a bunch of people away, but opponents may not be able to triple team Justin Jefferson. Not that that's going to matter. He is in a tier all by himself. Starting off tier 2 might be a little bit of a surprise to you. Tyreek Hill, back-to-back years with over 110 receptions. He proved that he can be elite without Patrick Mahomes. He had 1,700 yards, the most yards in his career, and he only had 7 touchdowns. That could go up. He's also aiming for 2,000 yards, and he might actually get there. And if so, tier 2 might be too low. The next player I have in tier 2, Ja'Marr Chase. Ja'Marr Chase has crazy upside, and he is a touchdown hawk. He only played 12 games last year, and he had 9 touchdowns. Absolutely elite. And those receptions can go up. He was on a 17-game pace of almost 1,500 yards and 13 touchdowns. If that's not elite, I don't know what is. Now, you're probably expecting Cooper Kupp to fall here in tier 2. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but after that injury, I'm a bit nervous. For those of you who've been sleeping under a rock for the last 48 hours, Cooper Kupp re-aggravated his hamstring injury and is currently day-to-day. This close to draft season, I had to drop him down. I now have him as my wide receiver 4, but he's not in tier 2 anymore. He dropped down to tier 3. Hill and Chase are just much safer at this point. I have Cooper Kupp at the top of tier 3. Everybody knows this man's accolades. When healthy, he's the best wide receiver in football. He's a 30-year-old receiver coming off a season-ending injury last year, and now he's banged up before he starts the season this year. The talent is unquestioned, but the health isn't. Right now I have him at 4, but honestly, I wouldn't blame you if you took anybody that's in tier 3 ahead of him. This close to draft season, it's risky getting a hamstring injury because he can miss no time, be out 1 week, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, I don't know. And when he comes back, you're gonna be worried that he's gonna re-injure it. This is really a bummer. I have him at 4 right now, but I wouldn't blame you if you dropped him down to 9. This all comes down to your risk tolerance. If you like to play it a little safer, don't draft him. It also depends on where he falls in your draft, because he does have number 1 overall upside. I'll tell you this, I'm not drafting him in the top 5 anymore, and that's extremely disappointing. He was unbelievable in 2021 and last year before he got injured. 145 receptions, almost 2,000 yards, and 16 touchdowns. And last year, he was on a 17-game pace of 142 receptions, over 1,500 yards, and 11 touchdowns. But can you trust him? Wide receiver 5, we got Stefon Diggs, also in tier 3. Stefon Diggs is an elite wide receiver with a fantastic quarterback. He's had back-to-back years with 10 or more touchdowns and 100 receptions in the last 3 years. Diggs is still a great pick. Next up in tier 3, we have CeeDee Lamb. He broke out last year, getting over 100 receptions, over 1,300 yards, and 9 touchdowns. The Dallas Cowboys did lose their offensive coordinator, Kellen Moore. Head coach Mike McCarthy says that they want to run the ball, but their actions have not proven that. They brought in Brandin Cooks, and Michael Gallup's finally going to be healthy, hopefully. They have Tony Pollard and Deuce Vaughn. It's not really a running juggernaut. No shade on Pollard, he's just never had that workload. If you really wanted to run the ball that much, you'd probably bring in another running back just to bolster the backfield. I don't know. At the end of the day, best receiver on the team, CeeDee Lamb. The next receiver off the board has a couple of question marks. But one thing that's not a question, is he elite? Because he's one of the best wide receivers in the game. But who's throwing to him is pretty mid. Davante Adams. Davante Adams has been one of the best wide receivers in the league for the last 7 years. He's had back-to-back 1,500-yard seasons, double-digit touchdowns 6 of the last 7 years. And for everybody saying that he couldn't do it without Aaron Rodgers, Derek Carr got him 100 receptions, 1,500 yards, and 14 touchdowns. I'd say that's pretty good. And the only reason he's not higher is because we don't trust Jimmy GQ. Jimmy Garoppolo, for everyone who's new to the channel. Next up, we have AJ Brown, physically dominant receiver. It's hard for me to say AJ Brown broke out last year because he was so good before he got to the Eagles, but he just took it to another level with Jalen Hurts. In his first year in Philadelphia, he had a career high in targets, receptions, yards, and tying his career high in touchdowns. He had almost 1,500 yards and 11 touchdowns. Now that's elite. But the thing that's keeping him in tier 2 is his team. He's not the only one here with an elite number 2, but they also have a tight end that they'd like to use, Dallas Goedert, and a rushing quarterback that'll take off if he feels too much pressure. All of these things take targets away from A.J. Brown. I never thought I'd say this. One thing that may really help him is the fact that they might play fourth quarters. Last year, they were dominating by so much, they really didn't have to play the whole game. Well, the schedule gets harder when you go to the Super Bowl. So I think that can actually keep him on the field longer, which would help his fantasy points. Rounding out tier 3, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Amon-Ra thrives in PPR. He had 106 receptions with 1,160 yards and 6 touchdowns. I'd like if those touchdowns went up. And with Jameson Williams gone, TJ Hawkinson gone, I think that he's going to get even more targets. I know Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be involved, but Amon-Ra St. Brown is set up to get peppered with targets. I wouldn't blame anybody for taking any of these players over Cooper Kupp, just purely for safety purposes. I still think that Cooper Kupp will be elite, but if you're risk averse and you don't want to deal with the headache, these are all great receivers. Heck, even a lot of the guys in tier 4 are going to be great receivers, but none of them, I repeat, none of them have Cooper Kupp upside. That's not just best receiver in fantasy. That's best player in fantasy football. Makes me a little nervous. But if you're willing to pick him, you could benefit. No risk it, no biscuit. Starting off tier 4, we have Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson had a good rookie year with terrible quarterback play. I mean, we're talking Zach Wilson, Matt White, Joe Flacco. And he still put up a respectable line. 83 receptions, over 1,100 yards, and 4 touchdowns. This is all changing now that Aaron Rodgers is here. Those touchdowns, way up. He has one of the highest chances in the league to have double-digit touchdowns. Can't say that about many sophomore receivers. Aaron Rodgers doesn't throw for a crazy amount of yards, but he can throw for a crazy amount of touchdowns. And they're going to be aimed at that guy. Next in tier 4, Jaylen Waddle. Jaylen Waddle has elite speed. He ain't Tyreek fast, but it's close. He had over 1,350 yards. It's 75 receptions. That's 18 yards per reception. Wild. He's down in tier 4 because he has no shot at being the number 1 wide receiver on his team. But even being the number 2, he's proven that he deserves this spot. Waddle's going to have a good year, especially if Tua stays healthy the whole year. Next up in tier 4, Chris Olave. Chris Olave also had a good rookie year, getting 72 receptions, over 1,000 yards, and 4 touchdowns. But now that Derek Carr's there, he has a respectable quarterback. For everybody hating on Derek Carr, he throws a pretty solid deep ball, and he threw it a lot last year to Davante Adams. Everybody thought that Davante Adams was going to go down when he had Derek Carr. Well, he didn't. Chris Olave is going from garbage quarterback to pretty solid. People are going to be changing their tune about Derek Carr at the end of this year. Mark my words. And if Michael Thomas is actually back, that's a question mark. He's a big body that defenses will have to account for, which will leave Chris Olave even more open. Next up, we got another wide receiver 2 on an elite offense. T. Higgins has a top tier quarterback and a wide receiver on the other side that's going to be taking away most of the coverage. 74 receptions in back-to-back years. He played 16 games, but to be honest with you, 2 or 3 of them he was taken out towards the beginning. He barely played at all. Over 1,000 yards in back-to-back years and 6 or 7 touchdowns. I think those touchdowns can go up. I think those yards can go up. My man's got to stay healthy. Next up, Keenan Allen. I love Kellen Moore going to the Chargers. I think he's going to make this offense even more explosive. He's going to move Keenan Allen all around the field. Keenan Allen is a PPR machine. He's had over 100 receptions 4 of the last 6 years. And he was on pace to do it last year, even though he got hurt. Check that at the top. 17-game pace of 112 receptions and almost 1,300 yards with 7 touchdowns. This is PPR, people. I want all the receptions. Rounding out tier 4, we have DeVonta Smith, wide receiver 2 on the Philadelphia Eagles. DeVonta Smith had a fantastic sophomore year. 95 receptions for almost 1,200 yards and 7 touchdowns. Yes, I know there were some injuries on the Eagles that helped get him here, but they also didn't play fourth quarters. So the same thing that went for A.J. Brown goes for DeVonta Smith. If they play all 4 quarters, DeVonta Smith is going to be more involved, and this is a talented kid. I mean, he didn't win the Heisman at 170 pounds soaking wet for no reason. Duh. My man is shifty. Year 3 is going to be good. Moving down to tier 5, we got DK Metcalf, an absolute beast of a man. He is huge. He makes cornerbacks look teeny tiny. A lot of people were down on DK Metcalf last year because Russell Wilson left and they had Geno Smith. But Geno Smith proved that he is going to be a solid to very good quarterback in the NFL. Last year, DK Metcalf had a career high in receptions with 90, over 1,000 yards, but his touchdowns were down. The lowest touchdowns in his career with 6. I think that goes back up. Prior to the 6 touchdowns last year, he had back-to-back years with over 10 touchdowns. I only have him statted for 8 touchdowns. If he gets 10, he's going to be a steal in drafts. Next up in tier 5, we have Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper is notorious for his hit or miss games, his home road splits. But at the end of the year, he's probably going to give you somewhere around 1,100 yards, 8 touchdowns, and 75 receptions. He's had 1,100 or more yards 3 out of the last 4 years, 8 or more touchdowns 3 out of the last 4 years. We all know what this is. This is a gamble on Deshaun Watson. Do you think Deshaun Watson is going to be that dude? Or do you think he's going to be how he was last year? Which was objectively speaking, awful! If Deshaun Watson gets back to Deshaun Watson that was throwing it to DeAndre Hopkins, Amari Cooper's going to show out. Now, I don't think he gets back to that Deshaun Watson, but I do think that he's better than he was last year, which will make Amari Cooper pretty solid. I think he's going to get around his average. 75 receptions, over 1,100 yards, and about 8 touchdowns. A lot of the people are afraid of this next wide receiver, but for some reason, I'm not so much. I think he's got some upside. Marquise Hollywood Brown. A lot of people are worried about Marquise Brown, obviously because Kyler Murray is banged up. No, we don't know when he's coming back. And yes, the Cardinals are clearly tanking. Dropping Colt McCoy was proof of that. But they have to throw the ball somewhere. And Marquise Brown is clearly the number 1 option there. So even if they are a bad team, he is going to be peppered with targets. And if they do happen to bring back Kyler Murray, you're getting Marquise Brown at a fantastic value. I honestly didn't know when this next wide receiver was even going to play football again. I mean, heck, he hasn't been good since 2020. That was 3 years ago. If you haven't figured out who I'm talking about yet, my wide receiver 19, Calvin Ridley, was fantastic when he broke out in 2020. In 2020, in 15 games, he had 90 receptions and 1,374 yards with 9 touchdowns. Things took a turn for the worst after that, though. In 2021, he only played 5 games, I believe due to personal issues. And then in 2022, got caught gambling. Can't do that if you play football, at least not in certain parameters. I don't know all the rules, but he broke them. So he sat out a full year. And now Calvin Ridley's on the Jacksonville Jaguars playing for the best quarterback he's ever played for, Trevor Lawrence. In preseason training camp, he looks pretty crisp and it looks like he's got some upside. I'm curious to see what he can do. Starting off tier 6, we have DeAndre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins has spent his whole career being an absolute beast. Unfortunately, he hasn't played a full season since 2020. Last year, he only played 9 games for Arizona, but he was on a 17-game pace of 121 receptions and 1,354 yards. Only 6 touchdowns, though. That's not bad for an old receiver. Now, just to be frank, I don't think that he is the same receiver he was a few years ago. His skills against man coverage have been declining the last 2 years, but he's clearly the best receiver they got. Treylon Burks is not that dude. The offense will go through Derrick Henry, followed up by DeAndre Hopkins. Now, the Titans aren't notorious for throwing the ball a lot, but I do think that DeAndre Hopkins is going to be involved enough to be worth his draft capital. Next up in tier 6, we have Chris Godwin. I think Chris Godwin is finally healed from that ACL tear he had 2 years ago. And he did pretty well last year. In 15 games, he had 104 receptions. That's a career high. And over 1,000 yards. Now, only 3 touchdowns. But for a 17-game pace, he was on target for 118 receptions and almost 1,200 yards. Now, the Bucs won't throw the ball as much as they did when they had Tom Brady. But I do think that Chris Godwin is going to be very involved in the offense. And everybody's expecting the Bucs to suck, right? That means they're going to be down, meaning they have to throw the ball. It's mainly going to go to 2 places, Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. Very narrow targetry. This next guy's been playing with terrible quarterbacks his entire career. And this might be an upgrade in quarterback? I'm really not sure. DJ Moore. Move from Carolina over to the Chicago Bears with Justin Fields at the helm as the starting quarterback. Justin Fields isn't really a pocket passing quarterback. Honestly, I've really come around on DJ Moore. I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty down on him when I found out he was getting traded to the Bears. Mainly because the Bears don't really throw the ball very much. But that was before they had a real number one. I wouldn't throw the ball that much either if I had Darnell Mooney, who could barely stay healthy, and Chase Claypool. Now that DJ Moore is there, everyone can slide in their appropriate role. DJ Moore can be the wide receiver 1. Darnell Mooney slides in as the wide receiver 2. And Chase Claypool will be the wide receiver 3 with touchdown upside. Now the offense makes a little more sense. The pieces fit a little better in that puzzle. And DJ Moore's never had a talent issue. He's had a touchdown issue. Through the last 4 years, he's had almost 1,200 yards, but only 4 touchdowns. Last year, he had a career high with 7 touchdowns. That's not bad. I think he can get that with Justin Fields. I'm definitely not reaching for him, though. If he happens to fall in drafts, I'll think about it. Next up, we got the best dual threat wide receiver in the league, Deebo Samuel, who is an absolute beast of a man. Deebo Samuel is so hard to tackle. That's one of the reasons that makes him great. Another reason that makes him great is not just his ability to catch the ball, it's his ability to run the ball. In 2021, to go along with his 77 receptions for 1,400 yards and 6 touchdowns in the air, he added 365 rushing yards and 8 rushing touchdowns on the ground. Yes, you heard me right. 8 rushing touchdowns on the ground. Wild. Now, I don't think that he gets back to that level, especially because of how many mouths there are to feed in San Francisco. If they utilize him how they can utilize him, he's got some serious upside. Most people are down on this next wide receiver, and I can understand why. Tyler Lockett. Tyler Lockett is rounding out tier 6. The Seahawks drafted Jaxon Smith-Njigba as the first wide receiver off the board this year, which is causing people to look down on Tyler Lockett. Now, I get why you're doing that. High value draft pick, probably gonna replace the older veteran. I just don't think replace is the right word. I think Jaxon Smith-Njigba is going to play in the slot, and I think he's going to do a pretty good job of it. But I think he's a rookie. Tyler Lockett has proven that he's a very good wide receiver. He's had 1,000 yards the last 4 years. He's had 8 or more touchdowns the last 5 years. I think Lockett's still going to be a serviceable wide receiver that isn't going crazy early in drafts. I like Lockett. 5th round or later, I think Lockett's a pretty good value. This next receiver made history last year, but not for the right reasons. Starting off tier 7, Diontae Johnson, the first player in NFL history to get 141 targets and no touchdowns. 0. Zip 0. None. 0 touchdowns. Yikes. How do you even get targeted that much and get no touchdowns? Gross. It's probably an anomaly. In previous years, Diontae Johnson's had 8, 7, and 5 touchdowns. For him to have 0 touchdowns is absolutely ridiculous. I think he's clearly going to bounce back, and people are underrating him in drafts. Newsflash, people, he's not getting 0 touchdowns again. And this Pittsburgh Steelers offense has been looking pretty good. Not great, but pretty good. Kenny Pickett's going to get better this year, and that's going to help Diontae Johnson. I wouldn't be surprised if he got a touchdown early, just so they can get that narrative out of the way. This next receiver has been setting records, but for a good reason this time. Mike Evans. Yes, I know that Tom Brady is gone, but I think Mike Evans is still going to have a solid year, and he's got some upside. There's 3 things you can count on: death, taxes, and Mike Evans getting 1,000 yards, because it's happened every year of his career. Since 2014, Mike Evans has had 1,000 or more receiving yards. Now, to be fair, he had a very up and down year last year. It was not a consistent ride. It was more like a roller coaster. But I think Baker might be able to bring some consistency, and we know he's going to get 1,000 yards. Now, the touchdowns is the real question. He only had 6 touchdowns last year, which is the least amount of touchdowns he scored in the last 5 years. The first 2 years of Brady, 13, 14. Last year, 6. But those touchdowns could go up with a big body wide receiver like Mike Evans. And did I mention it's a contract year? For those of you who don't know, players tend to ball out on a contract year because they want that money. Cash rules everything around me. Cream, get the money. Dollar bills, y'all. Next up, we got another Mike. What is this, Mike and Mike in the morning? What's going on here? Mike Williams. No, not me. The player for the Chargers. Duh. Mike Williams is playing on a high-powered offense. I think Justin Herbert has a bounce-back year. That's going to lead to more offense for Mike Williams. What he really needs to worry about is staying healthy. My man can't stay on the field. He's only played 16 games twice. Just falls so hard. Next up, Brandin Aiyuk. Everybody's been hot and bothered by Brandin Aiyuk this offseason. He was pretty good last year. 78 receptions, over 1,000 yards, 8 touchdowns. I'm not sold on Brock Purdy. I think he's going to be fine, but there's a lot of options for this team. You got Deebo Samuel, Brandon Aiyuk, George Kittle, and McCaffrey in the backfield. That's a lot of mouths to feed. But every year it seems like the 49ers get hurt. And every year somebody's got to step up. I think Brandon Aiyuk is a solid receiver, and I think he'll perform as such. This next one was difficult for me to stat out. Drake London. This offense boggles me. Last year, he had 72 receptions, 866 yards, and 4 touchdowns. But that's not the part that boggles me. The part that makes it difficult to stat out Drake London is, what is the identity of this offense? I believe the identity of this offense is to run the ball. So you're going to get a lot of rushing out of Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier. Yes, Tyler Algier will get rushing. Stop acting like he's going away. But they spent a top 10 pick on Kyle Pitts, and they spent a top 10 pick on Drake London. So that makes me think they should be throwing the ball. But does anybody know if Desmond Ridder is good at football? No, seriously, that's an actual question. Is he good at football? Can he really keep 2 receiving options afloat? I don't know. I think Drake London is a good wide receiver in a run-first offense. He'll be all right. This next receiver is only down here due to a recent injury. Terry McLaurin. Terry McLaurin has never had a good quarterback in his career, and that is super unfortunate. Trust me, his shortcomings are not his doing. He needs a quarterback. And hopefully, Sam Howell can be that dude. Fingers crossed. He's had 1,100 yards or more in 2 of the last 3 years, but my man can't get touchdowns. 5, 4, 7, solid. At the moment, unfortunately, I believe he has turf toe, but I do expect him to be back sooner rather than later, and that's why he dropped this far. This next one has a large range of outcomes, just like his quarterback, Michael Pittman Jr. He's clearly the number 1 wide receiver on this team. He's in an interesting situation. He's got a rookie throwing on the ball. Jonathan Taylor won't be here for the first 4 weeks, so I'd assume he will get peppered even more with targets. But again, Anthony Richardson's a rookie. Not a huge fan of wide receivers with rookie quarterbacks. They don't have the best track record. Plus, he's never had more than 6 touchdowns. You think that's going to go up with Anthony Richardson? Probably not. Next up, Jahan Dotson. Jahan Dotson only played 12 games last year, but he had 7 touchdowns. Not too shabby. With Terry McLaurin dealing with turf toe at the moment, I think Jahan Dotson's going to be the number 1 target starting the season. Once Terry comes back and he's full health, he's clearly going to be that dude. But I think Jahan Dotson is talented in his own right. And I like that they have a new offensive coordinator. They were previously mostly a running team, but now that they have Eric Bieniemy, I do think they're going to get more creative with the ball. And creativity leads to opportunity, and Jahan Dotson will take advantage of said opportunity. This next player broke out last year, so why is he so low? Christian Kirk. He had a fantastic year last year. Signed himself a nice fat contract. Had a good year too. All of these numbers career high. 84 receptions, 1,100 yards, 8 touchdowns. So why is he down so far? Well, if you notice, he's not the first Jaguar on this list. The Jaguars brought in Calvin Ridley. And before the preseason, I might not have said that Calvin Ridley was going to be the clear-cut number 1. But looking at the way the Jaguars use Christian Kirk, I do think that Calvin Ridley's going to be the number 1 and Kirk as the number 2. Now, I'm hoping that he stays on the field in 2 wide receiver sets. I think that could really help his value. But if he's really the number 2 in Jacksonville, it's really disappointing for his upside and where you got to draft him. Now, everybody's really down on this next player, but I can't stop drafting him. Brandin Cooks. Brandin Cooks is still a good wide receiver, people. I don't understand why nobody likes him anymore. Is it because he keeps getting traded? I'm not saying that he's the best locker room guy, but this is fantasy football, people. You play to win the game. And Brandin Cooks is going to help you get there. Check this out. 6 out of the last 8 years, Brandin Cooks had over 1,000 yards. In 4 of those, he's had over 1,100 yards. And he's done that with multiple quarterbacks on multiple teams. And now he has Dak Prescott. Now, Dak Prescott is not the best quarterback he's had. That would probably be towards the beginning of his career. A couple of Hall of Famers. You might have heard of them. Drew Brees, Tom Brady. But Dak Prescott is still a good quarterback. And he's going to get his receivers the ball. Brandin Cooks is probably going to end up with 1,000 yards and 6 touchdowns. And you're getting him super late in drafts. I think it's pretty worth it. This next guy had an unbelievable run last year. Christian Watson. He didn't have many receptions, but the receptions he had, a lot of them turned into touchdowns. Aaron Rodgers wasn't great last year, but he still knows how to throw touchdowns. Christian Watson played 14 games, and he was banged up in a couple. He had 41 receptions, 611 yards, but this 7 touchdowns is really what took him over the edge. This man was having multi-touchdown games in multiple games. It was impressive for a rookie. Now that he has Jordan Love, I'm not as confident that this is going to be a regular occurrence. He's not really high up on my board, to be honest with you, but he's clearly shown that he can separate. Now, can Jordan Love actually get him the ball? That's the question. This next player apparently played through most of last year with a high ankle sprain. That might explain why he didn't break out as much as we thought he would. Gabe Davis. Gabe Davis has an incredible offense, a great quarterback. Now, he's not the number one, but he's a solid number two. That being said, he doesn't catch a lot of balls. The most he's had in his career, 48, and that was last year. Now, he did have 835 yards, which is great, and 7 touchdowns. Yards per reception, 17.4. That's incredible, especially for a guy that had a high ankle sprain. I think that he's worth a flyer where he's going in drafts. He definitely has upside, and though he's kind of boom or bust, I think depending on the roster construction, he could be really useful for your team. For example, if you have a Justin Jefferson that's going to get peppered with targets, Gabe Davis would work well with him because Justin Jefferson is going to give you a baseline with the receptions where Gabe Davis is going to give you those spike weeks. Just a little roster construction tip. These last 4 are all flyers, so I'm going to go through them pretty quick. First up, Courtland Sutton. With Jerry Jeudy banged up, I think he's going to be more involved in the offense. Sean Payton's there, and he's supposed to turn this team around. We'll see about that. Kind of stuck his foot in his mouth early on. Without Jerry Jeudy, I think that Courtland Sutton is going to be the number 1 target, at least for the beginning of the season. Marvin Mims will also step in. Up next, we have the once elite Michael Thomas. He was once considered the best wide receiver in football. Dynasty managers everywhere are cringing right now. He hasn't been relevant since 2019. But I'm hearing he's healthy, should be relevant. Let's see if he can stay healthy and do anything with this team. If he can be good, I'll be happy because he'll be on the opposite side of Chris Olave, and Olave won't be getting double teamed as much. So I'm curious to see what he's got. He was once dominant. Now, just hoping he stays on the field. Next up, Jordan Addison, rookie for the Minnesota Vikings. Anytime you're on the opposite side of Justin Jefferson, you're going to get some light coverage. I think this kid might be able to take advantage of it. And last but not least, we have JSN, Jaxon Smith-Njigba. The rookie that was so good that he didn't need to play in his final season to be drafted first wide receiver off the board in the NFL draft. Man, that's impressive. He played on the same team in college as Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave. When they were both asked who the best receiver was out of all 3 of them, they both answered, Jaxon Smith-Njigba. This kid's elite. Now, he goes to a spot where he's not going to be the clear-cut number 1 on day 1, the Seattle Seahawks. He's clearly behind DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, but he's going to slide in the slot, and I'm very curious to see how they involve this kid because he's talented, and talent wins out. He'll get some opportunities. And an honorable mention for Zay Flowers. I think Zay Flowers has a chance to take over that number 1 spot in Baltimore. I air quote it because everybody knows the number 1 pass catcher in Baltimore is and will be Mark Andrews. All right, let's do a quick recap of all those tiers. Tier 1, Justin Jefferson, all by himself. Tier 2, Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase. Tier 3, Cooper Kupp, Stefon Diggs, CeeDee Lamb, Davante Adams, AJ Brown, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Tier 4, Garrett Wilson, Jaylen Waddle, Chris Olave, T. Higgins, Keenan Allen, DeVonta Smith. Tier 5, DK Metcalf, Amari Cooper, Marquise Brown, Calvin Ridley. Tier 6, DeAndre Hopkins, Chris Godwin, DJ Moore, Deebo Samuel, Tyler Lockett. Tier 7, Diontae Johnson, Mike Evans, Mike Williams, Brandon Aiyuk, Drake London, Terry McLaurin. Tier 8, Michael Pittman Jr., Jahan Dotson, Christian Kirk, Brandin Cooks, Christian Watson, Gabe Davis. Tier 9, Courtland Sutton, Michael Thomas, Jordan Addison, and Jaxon Smith-Njigba, JSN. And of course, an honorable mention for Zay Flowers. If you want a more detailed breakdown on a lot of these players, click here or here. I go into a lot of these players in much more detail.